Welcome back to the Infinite Jungle. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the main takeaways of all core developers execution call number 207, where developers agreed to launch a brand new public testnet, Hoodi testnet, and they gave updated estimations for when Pectra could go live on Ethereum mainnet. Developers are now estimating that at the earliest, Pectra will go live in late April or early May, which for my returning Infinite Jungle listeners, this should come as no surprise. This was already estimated for several shows now that the timeline for Pectra would be delayed. However, now I'm going to give an updated estimation given the developers' updated estimation and timeline for Pectra activation. So lots to get into in today's show. Before we get started, here is a show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Ethereum protocol development is changing so fast. Week to week, the plan for Pectra is changing in drastic ways, and this week is no different. Lots of updates. Everything, the Pectra game plan that I shared on the prior Infinite Jungle episode, just throw that out the window because we've got a brand new one. And who knows how this one will change again in perhaps a week's time. But this is why hopefully my listeners keep coming back every week because Ethereum protocol development is very active and can change in big ways week to week. So what was the reason for the change in estimation for Pectra mainnet timeline, the change in the game plan and the strategy for testing Pectra? Well, the main reason was actually a very good one. Holesky, the testnet that has been broken, I think, for about 2 weeks now, reached finalization. It reached a state of heightened security much more quickly than developers anticipated. Developers were expecting that Holesky could reach finalization by the end of March, by the end of this month. But lo and behold, Holesky finalized several weeks earlier on Monday, March 10th. This was a community effort for sure. Holesky is supported by a diverse group of network stakeholders. You have staking providers and infrastructure providers, staking pools like Lido that are operating nodes, of course, staking infrastructure providers like P2P that is also on Holesky testing their software. And all of these node operators really pitched in to upgrade their software, get all of the validators that were not correctly attesting to the head of the Holesky chain exited. It was a true community effort, and what a success. The network has reached finalization, which is a great checkpoint for creating network stability and security. This is a point in which it is not technically it is technically infeasible to revert back to prior state before that finalization point in time. It's also called like a finalization epoch, which is just a period of time on the Ethereum blockchain. And this finalization point ensures that all of the transactions that have been processed up until that point are considered irreversible. And this is a really great checkpoint for nodes that are operating on Holesky to be able to quickly sync up to the network, quickly find peers that are also correctly attesting and validating the same head of the chain. It definitely means that Holesky has stabilized. However, yes, it's wonderful news that Holesky finalized sooner than developers anticipated because of the community effort of all of the node operators and the stakeholders that were part of Holesky upgrading their software. One of the remaining problems with Holesky is that the validator execute remains extremely backlogged. as validators, bad validators that were not correctly attesting to the head of the chain have been slashed, which is forcefully ejected from the network, or slowly penalized, and their minimum balance for staked ETH has dropped below a certain threshold, which means they will be ejected out of the network. For Ethereum mainnet, actually, that threshold is 16 ETH. If your balance drops below 16 ETH, effective balance drops below 16 ETH, your validator will be immediately exited from the network. But for Holesky, it's actually higher. It's around 28 ETH. And again, the reason why Holesky has been in a state of prolonged instability and non-finalization is because the majority of validators were attesting to the wrong head of the chain. And so all of those validators have been slashed, are being exited out of the Holesky testnet. And because of this, because of the 2-week period where developers and the entire community have been trying to resurrect this minority chain of Holesky, there are about 1 million validators that have to get processed through the Holesky exit queue. And so while the network itself is now stable, back to normal, developers, anybody that wants to test on Holesky can test smart contract infrastructure, can test new validator entries. When it comes to testing the specific part of the Holesky testnet that supports validator exits, there's a problem. There's about 1 million validators in that queue, and there's also a cap that restricts how many validators can exit on Ethereum at any given period of time, again, an epoch, and that limit is set to 8 validators per epoch. And I believe an epoch is about 12.4 minutes or 6.4 minutes, I believe. And so if you calculate how long it'll take for the validator exit queue to be rid of its backlog, it's going to take over a year. And obviously, that is not acceptable because testing validator exits is an important part of Pectra. And that is an aspect of Pectra code that not only developers want to test, but also, of course, app developers, specifically staking pools like Lido, of course, staking infrastructure providers. Again, it's an important part. It's an important feature that a public testnet needs to have, especially for in lead up to Pectra mainnet activation. That was the main problem that developers were trying to create a new game plan for. Now that Holesky is back up, it is stabilized, but there is this one part of the Holesky testnet that hasn't yet fully come back to normal. What do we do about that? What is the new game plan for testing Pectra in light of these new events that have happened, in light of Holesky having finalized, in light of the exit queue being 1 million validators? EF, the Ethereum Foundation DevOps engineer, Perry, who hopefully my Infinite Jungle listeners are now extremely familiar with. Perry has been on the show twice now. Perry on the call shared 4 possible options for developers, 4 paths forward, game plans for developers to discuss and move forward with. 1. The 4 options were, number 1, set up an entirely brand new public Ethereum testnet called Hoodi for developers and also for infrastructure providers, staking pools, all to test their test Pectra features. Number 2, the option 2, was to use Pectra DevNet 6. So this is a more developer-focused testnet for Pectra, the most recent one, and simply open it up to the public for further Pectra testing. Use this as the testing grounds for Pectra until June. And one of the developers that was sharing about this idea, or sharing comments in feedback to this idea, kind of mentioned, I can't remember who it was in the Zoom chat as just kind of like a side comment to this option, that Pectra DevNet 6 has some bugs in it, is experiencing some issues. But of course, if developers had gone with option 2, they would have fixed that and then released it to the public. one of the markers that Pectra, there's still aspects of the Pectra upgrade that needs to be tested. So that was Pectra, that was option 2. Option 3 was to launch a short-lived shadow fork of Holesky. And for my listeners, you should know that this was really the game plan for developers if Holesky did finalize at the end of the month. If Holesky didn't finalize sooner, developers in the meantime would have launched a short-lived shadow fork, a clone of the Holesky testnet for testing purposes for Pectra, basically for the infrastructure providers, for staking providers, app developers, and to keep that shadow fork going basically until Pectra goes live on mainnet. So that was the third option. And then the fourth option was to fork Holesky, the original Holesky testnet that is now finalized, issue an upgrade, a backwards incompatible upgrade on that testnet to kind of hack a way to clear out the execute. So hard code some kind of a solution so that when consensus layer client teams upgrade Holesky, they upgrade it in such a way where the validator queue is flushed out. And so those were the 4 options. A new testnet, Hoodi, Pectra DevNet 6 as the alternative, or a Holesky shadow fork as an alternative, or simply fork Holesky, the testnet itself. Initially, when developers were discussing these options, there was quite a bit of support for the fourth option. A representative from the Lido team, Lido is the largest staking pool on Ethereum. It has roughly 1/3 of total ETH staked, I believe, manages roughly 1/3 of total ETH staked on behalf of ETH holders. Representative from the Lido team, his name is Ivan, I believe, and he is the VP of engineering, if I'm not mistaken, VP of engineering at Lido, at the Lido DAO. Ivan shared that the reason why he is very supportive of the fourth option is because there's so much existing infrastructure on Holesky. For Lido, it's not only the smart contracts that make the staking pool to work, that support all the operations of the staking pool, but there are quite a bit of dependencies on how the smart contracts of Lido interact with other applications, and also depend on off-chain tooling, such as oracles and other types of monitoring, analytics. There's quite a bit of infrastructure that Lido has invested in and has already set up for monitoring how the Lido smart contract, how the staking pool operates on Holesky. And ideally, his point was that he would not like to move all of that infrastructure and set it back up again for an entirely new DevNet or an entirely new shadow fork or an entirely new testnet. He had mentioned on the call, doing this would effectively delay Pectra's timeline for mainnet, because it would take about a month to a month and a half for Lido to fully migrate over its testing infrastructure to a new testnet or a new DevNet, and to be able to adequately test all the features of Pectra. So his comments were very well received. Initially on the call, there was a client dev, I believe he was from the Besu team, that was also echoing Ivan's sentiments. And initially, developers were not opposed to hard forking the original Holesky testnet. This would mean that all of the existing infrastructure that app developers have on Holesky could still be used. And once the execute is completely flushed out through that hard fork, then all app developers would need to do is just test the Pectra features only, and then move on with getting Pectra on mainnet shortly thereafter. So that was where the conversation was headed initially during the most recent ACDE call. However, one of the concerns that many developers shared on the call was that actually emptying out that validator empty queue or validator exit queue may not be as simple as developers anticipate. That hot wiring and hacking parts of the protocol so that the validator exit queue is flushed out could could introduce far more complexity to the protocol. And now, of course, developers did say if we go with option 4 and we do kind of implement this hacky solution into the consensus layer clients for Holesky as a testnet would likely have to be deprecated very shortly after Pectra goes live on mainnet, because at that point, the kind of client software that is supporting the Holesky testnet is so far diverged. It's so different from Ethereum mainnet client software that developers should probably just delete and do away, deprecate Holesky entirely, because it has diverged so far from what mainnet parameters and specifications are. Now, this was, of course, an all-core developers execution layer call, which is more focused on execution layer-focused protocol changes. However, because of the nature of Ethereum upgrades, which are impact both the execution layer and the consensus layer, it's very rare that these calls only focus on one layer of the protocol rather than both. But still, when developers were discussing the exact requirements on the consensus layer side to flush out the validator execute, there weren't many consensus layer developers on the call. And there really weren't many developers that were sharing, this is how that kind of hard fork would need to be programmed. And because of this, developers on the call were not comfortable with moving forward with option 4 until they knew entirely what is the scope of this problem. Exactly how much time would it take for client teams to implement an upgrade on Holesky to flush out the validator execute. And developers ultimately settled on, okay, let's wait until the Monday testing call. So this conversation was happening on Thursday, March 13th. Let's wait a couple of days, reach out to consensus layer client teams for their feedback, and coordinate and make a final decision on Monday's Pectra testing call on whether they should implement a hard fork on Holesky. And this was really because there was a lack of information on really what it would take to make to do and complete the hard fork on Holesky. And one of the recommendations from Perry was to, in parallel with that discussion on whether or not to move forward with option 4 and to really scope out how long it would take for consensus layer clients to come up with new client releases to issue that upgrade on Holesky. In parallel to that, Perry had shared that developers should get a head start anyways on pursuing option 1. Because, and launching the new public Ethereum testnet, Hoodi testnet. The reason why is because if developers decide that scoping out the option 4 is just too much work and doesn't make sense for developers to do, then they'll need that testnet anyways. They'll need a new testnet for infrastructure providers to be testing on in lieu of Holesky, in lieu of not being able to test validator exits on Holesky. But if developers do move forward with a hard fork on Holesky, it's likely that Hoodi as a testnet will still be needed in the long term. Because again, developers' plan, if they go with hard forking Holesky, is to deprecate Holesky shortly after Pectra goes live on mainnet, which means that there is the need for a Holesky-like testnet for future Ethereum upgrades, for Ethereum app developers and the broader Ethereum ecosystem anyways. So Perry's suggestion was to, of course, explore option 4, but to continue progressing with option 1, try and launch the Hoodi testnet sooner rather than later because it'll be needed either in the short term or the long term. And developers on the call were very supportive of Perry's suggestion. So that was the game plan. That was the game plan mid-call, and I'm going to share how the game plan actually changed quite drastically again as the discussion moved forward. However, before we do, I also want to note kind of a conversation that happened in between those two game plan changes. That was the consensus of the call early on. And once that consensus was created, developers talked about the what is needed to see Pectra go live on mainnet. So developers were comfortable with that game plan, and then they started to talk about, okay, what now are we looking for to feel confident enough to set a date for launching the Pectra upgrade on mainnet? I'm going to talk about what developers said as the necessary flags, the necessary milestones that they'd like to reach in lead up to Pectra going live on mainnet. Because these are really why I think that the Pectra timeline is actually going to be a little bit more delayed than even what developers shared on the call. There were a couple of things that developers said they would like to test more as it relates to the Pectra upgrade. The first was shared by Ethereum Foundation DevOps engineer Barnabas. He shared that number one, which is kind of like a baseline, a no-brainer, I think. This is a must. Developers would like to see the Pectra upgrade go live on the Hoodi testnet, on the new testnet, without any major client bugs discovered, or would like to see the Pectra upgrade go smoothly on Hoodi. And that, I think, is a very, very wise choice because, as a reminder to our listeners, all of the public testnet upgrades where Pectra was activated did not go over smoothly. It did identify major bugs in client software. And now, of course, granted, a lot of these bugs were not related to the Pectra specifications in particular, but it was related to the readiness of client teams to upgrade these networks in a safe way. So one of the things that Barnabas was saying was that, okay, we're going to launch, there's plans to launch a new public Ethereum testnet. Let's try activating Pectra again on this new testnet. And if it goes smoothly, that is a great signal that developers and the client teams are ready to upgrade also Ethereum mainnet in a safe manner. So that was the first. The second one was shared by a Teku developer, Enrico, and he shared that he would like to see, he would like to test specific aspects of validator behavior on a very large testnet with lots of validators where Pectra is already live. So the Sepolia testnet, which is up and running and can be used for Pectra testing, has a permission validator set, which means the validator set is significantly smaller than Ethereum mainnet and, of course, the original Holesky testnet. So whether it be on Holesky or a network like Holesky, Hoodi, the specifications for Hoodi, which developers talked about on the show, or not on the show, but on the ACDE call, they shared they'd like the Hoodi testnet to be as close to mainnet specifications as possible and also have a validator set size that is as close to Ethereum's mainnet as possible. So one of the things Enrico was saying was he'd like to see the Pectra upgrade go live on such a big testnet, a testnet that is as big as Ethereum mainnet, and would like to see validators correctly attesting to the head of that chain, and would like to double check the validator behavior for responsibilities and roles like attestation aggregation. So the way that validators are aggregating votes on what is the correct head of the chain into a block. This is a very key part of what validators do on Ethereum. And his worry is that with some of the attestation refactoring changes in Pectra, there might be discrepancies in behavior or ways in which validators are not actually behaving correctly, and would like to test that before Pectra goes live on mainnet. Another one, this was mentioned by Prism developer POTUS, who we've actually also had on the show before, on the Infinite Jungle show before. He mentioned that he'd like to see testing on the Slasher software. This is an optional software that validator node operators can run in order to automatically detect slashable offensive malicious activity that's happening on the network that goes against the rules of the protocol, and automatically inform the network of this kind of activity. There's an additional reward that validators on Ethereum can earn if they do report slashable offenses to the network. That's kind of the incentive for node operators to run the Slasher software. However, POTUS was also sharing worries that in light of what happened on Holesky, the Slasher software is not operating and functioning correctly. So he would like to do additional testing to make sure that the Slasher software is functioning the way it should be. And finally, another developer who I'm not quite sure his background, his screen name on the Zoom was Spencer TB. I believe he could be part of the Ethereum Foundation testing team because his suggestion was really related to making sure that all execution layer client teams are passing their tests, their Pectra tests, that the Ethereum Foundation testing team has created. And through the Sepolia and the Holesky incidents, there have been new edge cases and new test coverage that developers have been wanting to implement, wanting to update in the Pectra tests repository. And so making sure that all of the tests that developers want for Pectra are in, have been updated, and then that all of the client teams are running against that updated test suite, and all of their client software is passing those tests. So as you can tell, there are quite a few steps. There are quite a lot of things that developers would like to test further about Pectra, which is why even on the earliest timeline that developers shared on the latest call, which is that at the earliest, developers are going to be able to activate Pectra on mainnet in late April. I do think that it's more likely that Pectra will go live sometime in May, and that is only if everything goes well. If everything goes super smoothly, I do think the earliest is actually, and to do all this testing, of course, the earliest that we could see Pectra go live is actually sometime in May. But of course, in the process of upgrading the Hoodi testnet and the process of, identifying and making sure validator aggregation, attestation aggregations are going smoothly, and the process of testing the slasher. If there's any major bugs or unexpected kind of flaws and fixes developers need to make to any of this, then I think the timeline could be delayed even further. So developers shared a very tentative timeline on the call. They said, very tentatively, the earliest Pectra could go live on mainnet is late April. I say that tentatively, at the very earliest, the upgrade could go live on mainnet is actually in May. But of course, barring we got to wait and see. We got to wait and see the Hoodi testnet go live. We got to wait and see how the Pectra upgrade on Hoodi goes. And then I think we'll get a clear picture of whether or not May really is, how confident we can be about May as the mainnet activation date. And there is, of course, the chance that bugs in the next couple weeks, any unexpected bugs in the next couple weeks could delay the timeline even further, so potentially beyond May. But I digress. Let's talk now about, in the last couple of minutes of the show, the actual game plan that developers came up with in the latter half of the call. So they had that game plan about coordinating the Holesky fork, potentially, with the input of more consensus layer client devs at on the Monday testing call. They talked about what they wanted to see over the next couple weeks in order to feel confident about setting a date for Ethereum mainnet. And then during the conversation where developers were talking about what they'd like to see, what kind of specifics, milestones they'd like to reach now in the Pectra testing progress before setting a mainnet date, in the midst of that conversation, Ethereum Foundation researcher Carl shared a few thoughts that many developers on the call were very in favor of and did change the outcome of what developers are going to do. So Carl shared that in his view, developers were not optimizing for the right thing. They were optimizing in the plan that they had for the Monday testing call and plan they had for Hoodi to basically activate Pectra on mainnet as soon as possible. And Carl shared that might not be the best goal, that perhaps developers should not optimize just to get Pectra on mainnet sooner rather than later. He said, quote, "I think another very important resource here is client developer time and attention. If we are having to wait for Lido, etc., to deploy things, client devs can be working on upcoming forks and more specifically PeerDAS, which brings much bigger gains further down the line," end quote. So Carl is basically saying that if developers only go with option one and completely forget about forking Holesky and not spend any time or resources on getting Holesky back up and running, then developers will have to, of course, wait on infrastructure providers, wait on staking pools like Lido to migrate all of their testing suites to the new testnet, and that would delay the Pectra timeline. But in that waiting period for all these other, for basically other stakeholders in Ethereum to get ready for Pectra, in that waiting period, then developers can be working on other things. They can be working on the next upgrade, Fusaka. They can be working on various long-term fixes to their client in light of what happened on Holesky, basically hardening ways in which developers can harden the protocol and increase the protocol resilience and security. There's a lot of other ways in which client devs can make use of that kind of dead time where developers would have launched the Hoodi testnet and are simply waiting for major stakeholders like Lido to get ready for Pectra. And this was very well received. When Carl shared this, I think many call participants kind of immediately latched onto that idea and shared that this is something developers really want to do. They really want to be in a place where they're not the bottlenecks for Ethereum protocol development and not be kind of in a state of rushing, trying to get Pectra out as soon as possible. Now, there was, of course, concerns because, again, Yvonne shared that this means that, Lido would need extra time to move over their infrastructure to the new testnet. And there was some discussion, okay, well, how can we help Lido? How can we help the likes of Lido and other infrastructure providers to be able to hit the ground running on the Hoodi testnet? We won't, salvage the infrastructure that is on Holesky because there will be that. I mean, infrastructure providers can still test on Holesky, but there will be that aspect of testing validator exits that will not be supported or not be functional for Holesky. That kind of testing would not be possible for Holesky given the backlog. So are there ways in which perhaps the Hoodi testnet could be launched with very similar, say, state or very similar kind of environment as the Holesky testnet? Is there ways in which developers could really put perhaps more time and resources in making sure the Hoodi testnet is as easy for the likes of Lido to migrate over to, and thereby shrink, the time that they would need to adequately test and get ready for the Pectra upgrade, and so hopefully, therefore, get Pectra on mainnet sooner. And to this, Geth developer Marius, who I've had on the show as well, twice now too, Marius shared this quote. And I really like this quote because it's kind of funny. And Marius is always the most quotable core dev because he always shares just thoughts very bluntly. He said, quote, "We are not going to go to mainnet before Lido has tested their stuff," obviously. Obviously, I say obviously. Back to the quote. "But I also don't think we need to spin up another network, spin up a shadow fork for them to test and spend like hundreds of thousands of dollars for that. We just do this network," the Hoodi testnet he means. "Everyone can maybe chill for a bit and maybe work on their client. I think there's a lot of client improvements that can be done that this Holesky incident kind of showed. Especially in Geth, we have a bunch of things that we would like to do and we don't have time for if we're always going after the next hard fork. So we should just schedule Hoodi and then work on the other stuff," end quote. It's funny because Marius is basically telling everyone, like, chill out. Everybody just chill out, take a breather, take this opportunity to launch the Hoodi testnet, let the other stakeholders of Ethereum cook, let them get prepared for Pectra, and in the meanwhile, client teams can do whatever they want. They can either take a break, they can start working on Fusaka, they can basically expend the energy where they think is most appropriate. And again, for Marius, he's sharing that one of the things he'd like to do, especially being on the Geth team, is to work on some of the protocol hardening efforts some of the improvements to protocol hardening that can be made in light of the prolonged non-finality that happened on Holesky. And this was surprisingly well received by Ethereum developers. And so ultimately, by the end of the call, the new game plan for Pectra now is do away with the whole option 4. Hard forking Holesky is off the table. It is likely that developers will continue to try and push Holesky to its limits, try and make Holesky into a testnet where infrastructure providers should be aware and should be cautious about deploying any new software, any new code to Holesky, because developers will use Holesky as kind of like a testnet that they can break and be a testnet where not all aspects of Holesky are functional, are back to normal, i.e. the execute, and won't be for the next over a year. But they're going to go ahead with launching Hoodi as the new public Ethereum testnet. There is a chance that this testnet, unlike other testnets, may only be around for 3 years rather than the kind of norm of 5 years that developers have set for Ethereum public testnets in general. But anyways, Hoodi will be the new testing grounds that all infrastructure providers and app developers will be encouraged to migrate over to, starting whatever Monday that is happening this week. It's hard because I record these shows on Friday. But it's basically the most recent Monday. This episode is going to go out on Tuesday. It's going to, hopefully, by the time you're listening to this, the Hoodi testnet will have launched. And that is the new testnet that infrastructure providers should be migrating over to. And developers agreed on the call that within 10 days of that launch, so on Wednesday, March 26th, that's 10 days after the launch of Hoodi on Monday, if all goes according to plan, 10 days after that, developers will activate the Pectra upgrade on Hoodi. So Hoodi will only have the Dencun upgrade already installed, already hard-coded into the genesis of that testnet, which is very similar to Ethereum mainnet today. Of the prior upgrade that Ethereum went through is the Dencun upgrade. So Hoodi will launch in a state and with parameters that mimic Ethereum mainnet as closely as possible. And then within 10 days, developers will upgrade Hoodi. This is the plan. Within 10 days, developers will upgrade Hoodi with Pectra. That takes us to March 26th. And fingers crossed, ideally, that Hoodi testnet upgrade goes well and Pectra goes smoothly. Developers are extremely confident about how Pectra is functioning. Infrastructure providers are also extremely confident about the Pectra features. And developers share, 30 at the earliest, developers would set the mainnet date after the Hoodi upgrade, 30 days from Pectra activation on Hoodi. Of course, I maintain that there will be some additional testing, of course, waiting on infrastructure providers like Lido to make sure that they've fully tested the Pectra upgrade that I think will actually push out Pectra mainnet at the earliest, likely sometime in May. But that is the plan. That was the plan that developers ended up going with. I go through this entire conversation because it's kind of interesting how developers for the past several weeks have been talking about how they want to ship faster, how the goal is to just move Ethereum protocol development to do 2 upgrades a year, not 1. And this 180 sort of in sentiment and shift in sentiment and behavior to let's just chill out. Pectra will not go live on mainnet as soon as developers can make it go live. They're going to take a step back and they're going to take a little bit of a breather, but allow the bottleneck and allow the necessary kind of rest of the testing that needs to happen fall primarily on the onus of providers like Lido, of app developers, of basically making sure that the ecosystem is ready. And when the ecosystem is ready, developers are saying, then we'll be ready to go live with Pectra. And of course, developers can do more to kind of expedite the readiness of stakeholders, the readiness of the likes of Lido. However, they're kind of drawing a line. They're drawing a line and saying, we're actually going to take the time to allow app developers to fully migrate over their infrastructure. And in that meanwhile, we're going to, continue to test various aspects of Pectra, of course, but also focus on other initiatives. And I think that illustrates that developers are coming to terms with reality, coming to terms with the fact that no matter how much Ethereum developers optimize their process, optimize what they view as how and when Ethereum should upgrade, in what way Ethereum should evolve, they're not the only ones that are responsible for upgrading Ethereum. Again, as Marius mentioned, developers will not upgrade Ethereum until Lido is ready, until major stakeholders of Ethereum are ready to go. So to a certain extent, the upgrade is a little bit, there's aspects of the upgrade and the upgrade timeline that is out of their hands. And yes, developers can try as much as possible to kind of take all the responsibility and to push the Pectra mainnet timeline as fast as possible. But there are downsides to doing that. And developers are realizing that it's okay for some of the bottlenecks to be left to the Ethereum ecosystem, to be left to Ethereum stakeholders to deal with, and for developers to better use their time, perhaps not bending over backwards to get every upgrade on Ethereum shipped as fast as possible. I appreciate, as I've been saying on these calls on these episodes for a while, I appreciate that speed is not the only priority that developers have, that developers are taking a step back and having a little bit of a broader view that, yes, they might be able to ship Pectra a bit faster, but that's not the only objective here. It is very healthy for the Ethereum stakeholders to now step their game up and try and migrate their infrastructure over, hopefully a little bit faster than than Lido's month and a half timeline per se, and to try and for developers to then focus on other things in the meanwhile. It's a bit of a shift, a bit of a change, a drastic change, I think, in the way that developers are thinking about protocol development, and I'm here for it. I'm very glad that this is happening. I do think that the incidents of Holesky and Sepolia have really given Ethereum developers a bit of a reality check. And I think it's very positive to see that protocol developers are more open to the idea of, yes, shipping upgrades fast is still a priority, but we want to do so without being, like blind, or to be very narrowly focused on just speed, because there's a lot of ways in which developers can optimize the protocol development timeline that has nothing to do with speed. It has everything to do with supporting the Ethereum ecosystem in their preparations of Pectra to an extent, and also for Ethereum developers to start prioritizing other ways in which they can spend their time, be it with protocol hardening, be it with preparing for the next upgrade, a bunch of other ways in which developers can really make use of kind of dead time, quote unquote dead time, where an upgrade is ready, developers have done what they can, and now it's just up to other areas of the Ethereum governance machine that needs to continue to move forward, to continue to keep the upgrade moving forward. So there you have it. That is the new game plan for Pectra as of this recording. I'll be back with a new episode to explain how this game plan is going, and maybe if any new changes have happened to the game plan. This was a bit of a longer episode, but that's because this conversation and what has happened on the most recent at the ACDE call was a bit of a shocker, and I really wanted to go through how the conversation flowed in a lot of detail. There was actually a lot else that was also shared on the call, but we're not going to get into that because it was not as important as the Pectra game plan. So if you want the full, of course, summary of the call, you can always find it in the show notes. I always link to them in the show notes. I hope that this was an interesting episode for my listeners. I hope that you learned something new about Ethereum. And I hope that you'll join again, of course, for a new episode next week. We have an episode coming out tomorrow, a guest episode coming out tomorrow with founder of the Defiant, Cami Russo. So please do stay tuned for that as well. Thank you for listening. I am signing off from the concrete jungle that is New York City in your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum. Stay safe out there.